I was like, I've just made $100,000 from signing a piece of paper.
Were there any challenges you had to overcome?
Yeah, the main challenges for me probably at the start were getting the next deposit. I don't really enjoy working. Like, I don't wake up in the morning and can't wait to get to work. Now I'm about 1,000 commercial properties under my belt, and I probably won't go back to residential unless.
Hi everyone, welcome again to another episode of Passive Income Doctor. Today we have an interview with a special guest, Steve Palise, who's a buyer's agent specializing in commercial property.
Thanks for having me on, Daniel. This should be fun.
Can you tell me about your professional background?
Okay, so I was actually quite good at school. Like, I got like 99.5 in high school. And then I went into robotics. So I did mechatronic engineering at university with the aim to actually work in medical field. I wanted to do like robotic limbs and things like that. And then when I finished, my first job was designing like defibrillators and like just diagnostic equipment, ophthalmoscopes, stuff like that. But realized most of the robotics side of things was sitting at a computer typing code, and I'm a little bit too social to sit at a computer for 10 hours a day just typing code. So did the sellout thing and went and worked in a mining company, designing mine sites for a living. So I did that for 7 or 8 years. But when I was an engineer, I started accumulating like residential properties. So I think I got to about 8 properties before I left engineering, and then joined like a little kind of buyer's agency, just a startup. And then we grew that to about 30 people. And then I've shifted my interest into commercial more so, and spent the last 2 years gallivanting around Europe on my own. And now my own little business has kind of taken off. I have about 10 employees and we do about 10 to 15 properties a month. So engineer by trade, and then design, and now full-time property, which I love.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. I think they now say, the average person will have, multiple careers in their life.
My biggest thing, Daniel, was I was doing it when I wasn't getting paid for it. So like I would literally every lunch break be on realestate.com for 2 hours. And then when I go home, I grafted. When people say I've got a passive income, it wasn't passive because I was up to 1 a.m. every single night, like looking at properties. It even got to the point where like the directors of the mining company would come sit in my office and chat property with me. And then that was the kind of kick up the bum. I'm like, okay, there's obviously some form of passion here. Let's go away. Weirdly, when I joined the buyer's agency, I wasn't planning to actually do it forever. I was going to do it for a year or two, learn the craft a bit more. So that way the rest of my life, I can make smarter investing decisions. And then I loved not being in the corporate world. Didn't have to deal with any big long meetings or processes or paperwork. It was just get on with things and get stuff done.
Yeah, awesome. What was discussion around money like from childhood, and how has it influenced kind of your money mindset, investing mindset now?
We didn't really talk about money that much. We're actually fairly poor, but I didn't know I was poor because it was the norm. My dad was a TV repairman that repaired TVs from our garage. But the kind of the feeling around money actually came from, we went on holidays. Like we had a little apartment up in Foster, which is like 3 hours north of Sydney. We went up there like 8 weeks every single year for the first 18 years of my life. So it was never like, we never struggled for food or like clothes or anything like that. So it wasn't so much about you must sort yourself out. My mum was very big on education. That's why we all did really well at school, me and my 2 older brothers. But yeah, it wasn't really a chat. What it kind of sparked in me was the enjoyment I get out of not working. And I know I'm on a doctor podcast and you guys are going to laugh at me, but like, I don't really enjoy working. Like I don't wake up in the morning and can't wait to get to work kind of thing. I do it and it keeps my attention and I can have fun with it. But like my ideal life would be work 4 or 5 hours a day and do that 4 days a week. And that'll be it because it's enough to keep your attention and move there. But so I think having that kind of nice childhood of traveling, and not being kind of stuck at home and having a bit kind of nature and hikes and surfing and stuff like that kind of didn't change my money mindset. It changed my goal mindset, I'll say.
Yeah, definitely. And you've talked about how you were investing during your engineer days. Can you tell me about your investing journey and your property portfolio, numbers, if you wish to share? And
Yeah, that's fine. I'll be transparent. So like I originally started with residential, and being like I think I was a graduate engineer on like, I don't know, 55, 65 grand a year at the time. couldn't afford obviously like a proper big 500, 600,000 property. So I bought my first one in Western Sydney,
Mm.
just a little house in Blacktown, if you know what that is.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's nothing special about it. It's a fairly low socioeconomic area. I bought that for 230 grand on a 90% loan. So I only had to actually put about 32 grand into it with like 10% deposit, stamp duty, legals, lender's mortgage, insurance, and got into that one. But that was my light bulb moment because that went from 230 to about 330 in 1 year. So this was 2012.
Yes.
And me being like an engineer at the time, I was like, I've just made $100,000 from signing a piece of paper. Like
Mm.
on 65 grand a year, you can probably save what, 15 grand a year? So I've made like 7 years worth of working from signing a piece of paper. And that was my addiction moment where I went out and bought every single book. I followed all those young gurus with the big portfolios, listened to every podcast. And then that's where I became a fanatic and then just slowly chipped away and then bought another one up in Brisbane. Then I bought one in Foster, Launceston, it was Coffs Harbour, and then just started like I was the cash flow positive strategy, which we'll have a chat about later. I was buying stuff that kind of paid for itself.
Mm.
Mainly out of necessity, though. I didn't have a choice otherwise because I had to stick to the lower price points to keep moving into it. And then kept going and kept going. And then only when I actually joined the buyer's agency and I had a high net worth client say, oh, look, Steve, can you go buy me a commercial? And I said the same thing I tell like people think of about the myths of commercial is, oh, no, it's going to be like long vacancies. It's too much money to get into it, etc. And we bought, I think it was about a 900K warehouse and it was on a 9% yield. This is in Brisbane and interest rates were about 5%. So it was like positively geared like 35, 40 grand a year from the get go. And I was just like, I have to be missing something here. Like it can't be this attractive when you go out and buy a $900,000 residential property that costs you 10 grand a year to hold. And then that one went over and then I bought another one. And then now I'm about 1,000 commercial properties under my belt. And I probably won't go back to residential unless it's the principal place of residence because of that. But yeah, to finish off the story, after the residentials, I shifted into commercial and just started buying commercial properties instead, just to beef up the passive income so I could kind of travel and gallivant around Europe when I wanted to.
Yeah. And when you had those kind of 8 resi, at that point in time, were you positive or neutral or negative?
I had what I thought at the time was a really good passive income. It was like a 45, 50 grand passive income because all the
Mm.
stuff that I was
Yeah.
buying that was like 200 grand, 250 grand was about 5, 7 grand a year positive.
Yes.
Which probably gave me the little kick up the bum to leave engineering as well, because it's not so scary when you've got some form of money coming in. Because the real estate job, I was left, it was about 50 grand. So that kind of gave me that there. But then once I looked at commercial and realized, okay, you can buy $1 million commercial and be 20, 30 grand a year positive, it kind of wipes that out of the water pretty quickly.
How did you choose, Brisbane, Launceston, Western Sydney? Was there kind of a strategy to that?
It was probably the wrong strategy, but I thought it was the right strategy at the time. I used to just read all the books. So like, Margaret Lomas and
Yes.
person like that. Like she had books where you look at the criteria. So you look at like the population growth, the affordability, the infrastructure spending, the ability to move around. But most of the time it dictated my price point is what dictated it. Like
Mm.
I'd go, oh, look, I've got 40 grand equity. What can I buy for 250 grand? And then that would narrow my searches.
Okay.
And luckily the market's been fairly kind. Like the
Yeah.
last like 11, 12 years I've been investing, most
Yeah.
areas have gone up. So I haven't had really any hardships from it. Only now that I'm kind of a bit more of a student investor and I've now got 1,500, 1,600 collectively properties under my belt. I actually understand it a little bit more. But you touched on the land tax. I never really worried about the land tax because I was buying in multiple states and I was fairly low price properties. It was never over the threshold.
Yeah.
But I never push clients to buy or not buy because of land tax.
Yeah.
If you're paying land tax, you're doing very well. So
Mm.
like I don't say don't buy property because of land tax. I say don't buy because you want diversification. Like the likelihood that all the growth is going to come from Sydney or Melbourne,
Mm.
they're cyclical. So
Yeah.
I do it for kind of risk mitigation. And so I've always got a property in a growing market which I can pull equity from and move on to the next one.
Yeah. I think there's lots of stories of buying in Western Sydney in that 2009 to 2011 mark. So that was a excellent time to buy into Sydney. Kind of
You say that. So when I
280.
bought
Yeah.
in 2012 though, Daniel, like people were laughing at me, being like, "I can't believe you're spending $250,000 in Blacktown. Like it's not
Mm,
going to grow. Who's going to spend that much money?" But that's because Sydney market didn't move from like 2004 to
yeah.
2012. So everyone just there was a bad kind of precedence for this is what's going to come. But how many times in the last 30 years have you said someone like it can't go up anymore? Even I said that 2 years, 3 years ago at COVID. I'm just like, yeah, surely
Mm,
Sydney's only got like 10, 15% more to go in it. And it went 30, 40%. So no
yeah.
one actually knows. The main driver I look at is affordability though. Like if you look at the census data and look at average household income to average house price, it normally can't go more than 10 or 12 times that because banks won't lend. Bank servicing criteria won't let it go past that. So that's kind of where you can tell where the top of the market is.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's an awesome tip for our listeners. So moving on, can you tell us, with all the property purchase, either for yourself or for your clients, is there any kind of lessons that you've learned, and for you trying to grow your portfolio, were there any challenges you had to overcome?
Yeah, the main challenges for me probably at the start were getting the next deposit to accumulate really quickly. I was one of the lucky ones where, like, investing prior to APRA and the Royal Commission
Yes.
lending restrictions, it was a lot easier to get finance. So basically, if you could come up with the deposit, they'd give you the loan. That's probably my biggest lesson to clients now is don't look at like young people like me and other buyers agents and people in the industry that have like 20, 30 properties and think I can do that because your servicing will stop you for residential anyway. And this is probably why we want to have a chat about commercial. You will run out once you kind of go 5 to 10 times your income. The banks won't touch you anyway. Then you have to do something different, whether it be a value add or a development or a buy and sell strategy or a shift into high yielding commercial or like NDIS or boarding houses. So I'm not going to tell anyone how to do it, but
Mm. Yeah.
commercial does offer kind of an advantage there where your serviceability isn't an issue.
Yes. Perfect. Um, any commonly held truths about property investing that you find to be, wrong, basically?
Oh, okay. I might answer for commercial. I know we're going to have a touch on that kind of later in the podcast. But commercial, the biggest the biggest false lies about it is there's long vacancy rates. It's too expensive to get in it, and like the everyday investor can't get loans for it. But that's all nonsense. You definitely can get into it. You can even get into it cheaper sometimes. I buy like a couple of weeks ago. I bought $150,000 warehouse in Perth.
Wow. I guess every investor has like a favorite, or um, kind of the biggest win when you bought it. Do you have one in particular?
The first one that you get capital growth with is always one of the most important because
Yes.
if you've got 10 properties and one of them doesn't perform well, that doesn't hurt too much. Whereas if your first or second is a bit of a dud, obviously in growth. So first one's the nostalgic one. Probably my first commercial. So when I shifted to commercial, I bought a $440,000 cafe up in Brisbane in
Mm.
Ipswich.
Yep.
But it's a freestanding building next to Ipswich train station with
Wow.
10 car spots. And I bought that, I think it was about a 7.2% net yield. Um, Now I actually rent 10 of the car spots out to tenants, and that gives me an extra, I think, about 7, 8 grand a year. And the rent's gone up about 30%. So like that's like a 14% yielding property with development potential. I can build up to 42 meters tall with it. The funny thing is, I actually sent that to a couple of clients, and they said no to it. The first one didn't like Ipswich; they didn't like the lower socioeconomic
Yep.
region. And then the other one, which was a valid point, which I kind of brought up with them, was cafes come and go often, and the
Mm.
vacancies are a bit longer. So, like a cafe, like in this area, you probably are looking at 1 to 2 years vacancy if they do leave, and that kind of scared them off. But for me, it was kind of like imagine buying a freestanding building with 10 car spots next to Parramatta Station in Sydney's
Mm.
West 15 years ago. That was kind of the mindset with it. And then that's been tenanted ever since. And that property alone gives me about I think it's about a 25 grand passive income now for a 440 grand purchase. So it's not bad in the grand scheme of things. So that's
Mm.
probably my second favorite because it was my dipping my toe into the commercial world.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. And how tall, or how many stories did you say was zoned for?
You can go up to 42 meters.
Wow.
However, so I'm actually a chartered structural and mechanical engineer as well. Like I did
Yes.
that postgraduate. I know from stability, I can probably only build up to about 4 or 5.
Mm.
But that's still because just from the size of the block, the width isn't enough to get stability.
Right.
So what I'd probably do is if the tenant does ever leave, it's actually across from they're actually renovating Ipswich Hospital across the road. So I'll probably turn it into a specialized medical asset or keep it downstairs like a cafe or some form of commercial and build residential on top. Get the
Mm.
stability of the residential income to offset the risk of the retail and do that.
Yeah.
So it's just got options. That's why it's win-win. It's 2 incomes, development potential, decent yield, and it's on a freestanding block. So that's why I like that one.
Yeah. Perfect. And I guess we kind of know roughly what the answer will be for this one, but what's your personal philosophy about property investing? There's lots of debates about, capital growth versus cash flow and whether you can have both or you can't, and also how you select properties nowadays for your own portfolio.
Yeah, I grumble a little bit with people about the passive the cash flow versus capital growth strategy. Your goal should be to get the best return possible. Get the best net return possible, whether that through capital growth, through cash flow. The silly thing is the people that are saying they want the cash flow strategy are going out buying neutrally geared residential properties and then saying don't buy a negatively geared 15 grand a year property. If the 15 grand a year one grows more than 15 grand than the other one, of course it makes more sense to do it. However, as I touched on before about how lending used to be a bit easier for me back in the day, now lending is really hard because of serviceability. So the negatively geared strategy, even if there's an argument that you get more capital growth, which is wrong because there's plenty of like positive cash flow properties like my Blacktown one that have still tripled in value in the last 10 years. You run into servicing issues. So you need to be very mindful of that with the cash flow. And then that's why some people shift into the high yielding commercial properties just so they can keep their portfolio going because everyone's going to have a glass ceiling. Their glass ceiling is going to depend on their income and their liabilities, i.e., kids, outgoings, credit card debts, car debts, all that type of thing. So I'd say work out your own strategy and what you're actually trying to achieve. My biggest thing is most of the time I talk to clients, they set a goal. They always just try to match their income. And especially doctors, like they might be on, say, 300, 400 grand a year.
Mm.
And they just say, I want to have a 300, 400 grand passive income. And then I say, oh, why do you want that? And they go, oh, I want to be able to travel the world. And I go, well, that doesn't cost 300, 400 grand a year. Like I've just spent 2 years overseas and probably spent 130, 140 all up.
Yeah.
And that wasn't me slumming it. That's flying business, staying in hotels. And just because obviously some countries in Europe are a bit cheaper as
Yeah.
well. But why work in a job that you don't want to for an extra 10, 15 years to get a passive income you don't need? So I'm all for setting more realistic goals and getting there sooner. And then work becomes funner anyway. If you don't have to be there, you get less stressed with it.
Yeah. I, I think
Sorry, I
that's a
know that was a
really.
long-winded answer.
Oh no, perfect. That's it's a great way of looking at things because I think some doctors, especially in some specialties, are kind of in a bubble, I guess, where they think everyone spends this much, and you don't. A lot of things in life, don't actually cost that much or are free.
The hard thing for doctors is you guys have such a long, hard slog. By the time you do your internship, your residency, you get into a specialization, then you train in the program for 5 years, you're normally 30, 40 years. So the time you actually flick the switch and actually start earning really good money, you feel like you have to really graft for the next 10 years. So you kind of in a trap where you get locked in until you're 40, 45 as a minimum, unless you've obviously started with a bigger nest egg. But most of my clients are the ones who they don't have much savings through university, and it kind of comes after they get through their residency and they start to find their straps a little bit.
Yeah. And that leads perfectly to the next question about your typical client's common theme about why they want to switch, for example, from resi to commercial. Yeah.
Yeah, so I still buy residential properties. So a lot of the times when I get the younger doctors, I actually end up kind of pushing them into residential. And the main reason for that is you can get away with smaller deposits. So a lot of obviously Medico lenders, you can get 90% loans with no lender's mortgage insurance.
Mm.
So why wouldn't I take advantage of that? Instead of going to commercial where I need a 20 or 30% deposit, I'd rather buy 2 or 3 times the portfolio, because if I get the same capital growth, they're going to make 3 times more capital to put into the next property. So that one I might guide them there. Your listeners probably going to kill me over this, but like culturally, I get a lot of negativity from your younger doctors and industry as well about kind of work culture, and they actually want to build a passive income to be able to get out of it sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
And again, that might be biased because I'm getting the ones obviously that are contacting me, so I'm hearing about it more. But I have a full plethora of clients. Like I'm under contract on the moment on a $26 million property
Wow.
for kind of a 55 or 60-year-old doctor, I think he is. He's a
Yeah.
ENT specialist. So yeah, it's just the main thing is when someone comes to me, you want to look at what they're trying to achieve over what time frame versus what they've got to work with. So what I mean by what they've got to work with is obviously how much savings they have, and then how much servicing they have for properties. And everyone's got a different servicing. So like you might have, if you're early on in your portfolio, $2 million servicing for residential. And I'm using round numbers. You can halve it or double it. I'm just trying to make it kind of nice for the listeners. $2 million for residential, but you only might have 1.2 mil for commercial because you need a bigger deposit. And then on the flip side, you get other clients. Like I had he's not a doctor, but a few weeks ago, one who had about $2 million capacity for commercial and zero capacity for residential, because he was all out of servicing, but because commercial offers different lending options like lease stock loans,
Yeah.
he had the capital, he had the money sitting there. He just didn't have any servicing for residential. So that even if he wanted residential, commercial would have been a smarter option.
Yep. Perfect. So we'll move on to talking about commercial property in more detail, and I will want to say to my listeners, definitely read Steve's book and listen to his podcast as well. It's got great breakdown. But firstly, what are the pros and cons of commercial? We've kind of touched on that.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, what are the asset classes available?
Yep. Okay. If your listeners want my book, just go to my website, paliseproperty.com, and then just type in free book at checkout, and I'll send you a hard copy for free. So that's fine. Okay. So pros and cons of commercial. I will start with the cons. So I've sort of alluded to it before. The biggest negative with commercial is you need a bigger deposit, minimum 20%. There's a few lenders doing 20% at the moment. BOQ, Suncorp, ANZ, Liberty Finance, they're doing 20%. Normally it's a 30% deposit. So you need a lot more capital to get into it. People will say they're more expensive, but like I mentioned before, you can get little cheap warehouses in Brisbane and Perth and areas like that. So it's not necessarily, but the capital is the main one. The other one is if you don't know what you're doing, you can get burnt massively, because it's not like residential where as long as you buy in a good suburb and check for flood zones and easements, long term you're going to be all right. You can burn yourself if you don't have a tenant for a long period of time. So like just in terms of due diligence, like I have to give my client about an 80-page due diligence report, because you do like lease review, contract review, tenant interview, foot and road traffic analysis, vacancy studies, occupancy studies. You got to check the lease is registered. You got to talk to the tenant. You got to talk to town planners. You need to do competition analysis. You got to check the mezzanines are approved, et cetera, et cetera. There's quite a lot to it. And then that's where most people kind of fall over. They see the dollar signs of, oh, look how high yielding this property is. The tenant leaves and they have a long period of vacancy. So they're probably the two biggest negatives. The positives, you get the exact same capital growth as residential. And some of your listeners are going to say, no, that's you're lying, Steve. That's impossible. You can't have the same. The easy way I kind of prove that I'm wrong is if commercial had less capital growth than residential, why is it more expensive typically than residential? You can't, if residential was having 3% more capital growth per year, shouldn't residential be 2-3 times the price over 30 years? There's a few reasons for that myth. One of them is it happens out of cycle with residential. Other ones, certain commercial don't grow the same. So like an office space won't grow the same as a warehouse because one's got a land component, one doesn't, things like that. But back to answer the question, the biggest positives is the cash flow. Like you get 5 to 9% net yields. And I emphasize the net. Net means because you don't pay the outgoings, the tenants pay it. They pay the council rates, the water rates, the maintenance. Whereas say you go buy a 4% yielding, gross yielding residential property, you've still got all those as a bill. So you actually end up being like a 2.5% net yielding asset.
That's right.
Whereas commercial, I'm getting 6-7%. So I'm getting 2 to 3 times as much cash flow come in. And then that's why they're such cash flow positive. So yeah, positive cash flow and capital growth for commercial. Negatives, if you don't know what you're doing, you'll burn yourself and you need a bigger deposit typically.
The three main asset classes is office, retail, and industrial. Do you have any favorites within each of these asset classes?
Yeah, so I really like industrial. For me, it's the most versatile asset, especially if you're a first time investor, because it can be anything. It can be a car mechanic, wholesaler, distributor, fabricator, storage. Like it's got a lot of uses. The other thing is it's easy to understand because you can look at all the other warehouses in the complex, what they rent for per square meter, what they sold for per square meter, the ones that went vacant, how long they were vacant for. So you can get some like accurate numbers for your decision. Just to put in perspective, vacancy rates for industrial are all-time lows. Every capital city is sub 0.5%. So like some of the areas of Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane, it's 0% vacancy rates. If you lose your tenant, there's a waiting list. So when people say, oh, you can have high vacancies, they're right in some form, but not for industrial at the moment. So industrial is my front runner. Second to that is probably retail, but suburban retail. So that's where I'm talking medical, dental, hairdressers, cafes, just the local shops where there's no competition. So if you've got a strip of 10 shops and the population in that suburb's growing, that can still be a really low risk asset class. And then office space, I'm not a huge fan of because one of the fundamentals for me with investing is own land. Like land's what we've been having wars over for thousands of years. So I want to own as much as that I can. You can always build up. So what happens if for office, if they ever want to grow in price, they'd knock down 5 like houses next door and build another 20-story skyscraper and price you out of the market. So I want to have the dirt, and that's why I don't like it. Some office can make sense. Obviously, like I'm on a doctor podcast, medical precinct office can make sense because they all want the specialties in the same building near a hospital and things like that. So I'm not against it, but in that order, industrial, retail, office is probably my favorites.
Awesome. And I know on your podcasts with Andrew, the commercial property podcast mentions some more specialized assets.
Yeah, so like I'll go self-storage. My Andrew, who I do the podcast with, he explains caravan parks as basically self-storage, but for people, so which I found quite funny. But self-storage, people like it because they see it as lower risk because they're like, well, instead of having one tenant, I'm going to have 100 tenants, and that's going to mitigate the risk, which they're right. However, you don't have long leases, so you don't have like 5 years. Like if you were to go out and buy a $2 million industrial shed with one tenant, they'll probably sign a 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 year lease. Whereas the short term, like self-storage one, they're on month to month. So even though the line's more stable, you're not getting the big leases, which actually wipes out lease stock loans as well. So finance can be a little bit harder. The other reason why, so I'm actually not a huge fan. I don't own any of it. And one of the reasons is it's also a business. Like you can't just go hire like a normal real estate property manager to manage 100 different self-storage. There needs to be a business operator, or you've got to have the technology that people can book in themselves. That's also why the co-host actually loves it, because you can manufacture value. You can do better signage, better websites, better street exposure, add extra dwellings on. So he likes the versatility of that, but it's not as simple as you think. It's a very specialized asset. So if you are going into that, make sure you understand it really well.
Yeah. And I guess some people say, commercial is more, cyclical than residential, or seeing that industrial cap rates have been, compressed in the last few years. I guess, it sounds like, rental vacancy is still very low. But I guess, would this last, would it be considered more risky buying in now after, values of industrial warehouse, for example, doubling over, some warehouses might have doubled in the last, 3, 4 years, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so this is the hard thing to answer with commercial, and probably why there's a lot of misconceptions is because like people like me will go out and say a statement and then people will apply it to every single asset class. Like what I say about industrial does not apply to office space. Same as if I read an article about office space and I regurgitate and say commercial's bad because of office, that's got nothing to do with it. It's kind of like saying don't buy Sydney properties because like Townsville has gone down in value. Like
Mm.
it's not like for like. Um, no one's got a crystal ball, Daniel. Anyone who can guarantee you that capital growth is forever, just run a mile. If there was that easy, I'd be living on my private island with Richard Branson in the Bahamas somewhere. All I do is look at demand. So I never guarantee capital growth because there's external factors when you're investing. You've got lending, you've got interest rates, you've got recessions, the economy, there's other factors at it. All I look at it when I go, say I'm buying an industrial property, I look at that and I go, is this property going to be in more demand in 10 years' time than it is now? So if I buy an industrial complex and it's surrounded by residential property, and that residential population is growing because they're building more high density apartments and people are moving to the area and things like that, and they're not building any more industrial sheds, if the vacancy is 0%, unless there's a big recession, why is there going to be less demand for it in 10 years' time? Because there's more people. They need more services. They need more e-commerce. They need more car mechanics and things like that. So I'm not guaranteeing capital growth. More demand usually means capital growth. But to put it in perspective, the commercial market, especially industrial, the figures are the best we've ever seen. Like
Mm.
vacancy rates are all-time low. Unemployment's at an all-time low. Because of inflation, rental increases are all-time high. So like on
Yes.
paper, everything is perfect. The only negative is there's high interest rates. But that's actually why there's high interest rates. That's because like they're trying to calm the market down from going through the roof. And I'm actually a supporter of high interest rates. I don't want the commercial market to grow by 50%, then drop by 30%, and then grow by 30%. I don't want a yo-yo market. I want a nice, stable market for the next kind of 10 years. So I can't see like 7 years ago, vacancy rates for industrial were like 7 to 15%. So even if they went up to 2, 3%, it's still quite a strong market. The office space one is the big unknown for me. Like obviously with the working from home culture, vacancy rates at the moment in most capital cities are around the kind of 12 to 18%.
Mm.
So that's still quite high. And I don't think the going back to work is going to be full time. It'll get better as people shift in 3, 4 days a week. But like I said, you can always build up there. The work from home culture has actually solidified suburban retail because now people go to their local hairdresser and medical center. They don't go to the city one when they're at work. So that's quite strong, but depends where you buy. Like we've all seen the retail that sits there vacant for 2 years, but then there's other regions where there's zero vacancy. Weirdly enough, regional areas can sometimes be lower risk for retail than capital cities because you know how when you go to like a regional town, they've
Mm.
only got the one main street. Like there's
Yes.
no other main street. So as long as you buy in that middle 2/3, some of the areas we buy, there hasn't been a vacancy for 10 years in that middle
Wow.
2/3. So but again, this is part of like understanding commercial and how to assess foot traffic. Even where the car park is for those kind of retail strips plays a huge difference. You want to be one of the shops closer to the car park so you get the foot traffic. You don't want to be at the end of the strip where people turn around after they get to the bread shop or the medical center. So you got to understand that part of it a little bit as well. So I know I didn't really answer your question there, but I kind of weaved to and fro.
Yeah. Oh no. Well, it ties perfectly with the next one about some of the things that newbie investors wouldn't be aware of. Stuff like your position on the street and proximity to parking. I guess other things from reading your book is I guess the lease, the strength of the lease. Basically, commercial things are more negotiable uh, compared to residential, and then some other stuff which we talk about. Kind of usually lower LVR lending, valuation fees. I believe you have to pay rather than the bank. And I guess vacancy kind of depends. I've heard anecdotally, I don't know how true this is, when there was a GFC last time, that some commercial investors, maybe some that were more highly leveraged or didn't have buffers, got wiped out in terms of like a margin call. In terms of if you have a vacancy, the bank might want to value the property again. And then obviously, if you have a longer vacancy, the valuation might be hugely below. And then sometimes you would owe the bank more than what the property is worth or things like that. I don't know if you know any older commercial investors that have had stuff like that happen.
It's one of those old wives' tales where I'm sure has happened because I've heard like bankers and say it, but like out of 1,500 plus clients, I've never actually met anyone that's actually had that happen to them. If they've like obviously if they stop paying the mortgage, the banks will take
Yes.
the property, but they do that with residential anyway. The banks normally work with you. If you lose your tenant, as long as you keep paying the mortgage, they might buffer it. They might put the interest rate up a little bit or something like
Mm.
that. But this is part of the planning with the commercial as well. Like to put it in perspective, like, and this is when people say, "Oh, I don't want to go commercial because it's too high risk." Let's say I buy $1 million commercial property versus $1 million house, and my $1 million commercial is 25 grand a year positive, and the $1 million house is 25 grand a year negative.
Mm.
In 5 years' time, I am up $125,000 in my
Mm.
pocket as a
Yep.
buffer. With the residential, you are down $125,000 in things. So even if it went vacant, I've got quite a large sum of money sitting there. So you can plan buffers a little bit easier. You always depend on what you're buying. You have a buffer for when the lease is going for renewal, how long to keep there, and things like that. So you do need to be a bit more astute. Like I said, with residential, you can get away with kind of not knowing what you're doing and be okay long term. But commercial, you can burn yourself, like I mentioned at the start.
Yeah, definitely got to do your due diligence. Have you had any horror stories? And I'm sure not your clients, but maybe other investors, or maybe a property that you passed on that someone else bought and had a bad outcome from not doing the due diligence.
Yeah, a lot of them are like, even like some of my competitors and things like that, they'll go buy like an industrial property in a really regional town because
Mm.
instead of getting like a 6% yield in Brisbane, they chase like a 7.5% yielding one in like a Rockhampton or something like
Yes.
that where vacancy rates might be higher. Then they lose the tenant. It looks all good on paper, like fresh 3 year lease. They lose the tenant and sits there vacant for 3 years because the vacancy rates are like 15-20%. Whereas I
Mm.
would have much rather buy the 6% yielding one in Brisbane, where the vacancy rates are 0.1, 0.2%, because you'll get better capital growth, better rental increases, and lower periods of vacancy. So your ROI will be much stronger by buying that lower risk asset, sort of alluding to that capital gain, capital growth versus cash flow kind of argument. So I see a lot of people kind of chase the dollars of net yields more than anything. From my own experience with my clients, like we had some where we had to work with the banks during COVID, obviously. So only like the cafes, or had a couple like
Yes.
gyms and things like that. That 6 months there was obviously tough where you give concessions. The banks were quite good at the time because they gave you interest free for the period. And then there might have been a few concessions with the tenants and things like that. But like I mentioned, the properties are positively geared and they were quite positive. So instead of earning 25 grand cash flow that year, they might have been neutral and now they're back on top. So you can mitigate. But I don't buy silly properties, Daniel. I buy very boring tick the box properties. Like I'm an engineer, like good tenant, good location, long lease, low vacancy rate region, versatile premises. Like I buy boring. Don't come to my services if you guys want a unicorn. I will get you a very strong performing property that will actually guarantee long term.
Yeah. So, towards the end of our podcast now, do you have any kind of general tips for negotiating on property for our doctor listeners? It could be residential, could be commercial.
I'll go commercial because that's probably what more people are more
Mm.
interested in. With commercial, everything is negotiable. So with residential, you don't have that choice. You got to put your offer in. If you're in certain states like Queensland, you might have a building and pest clause or a finance clause. But with commercial, you can negotiate absolutely everything. You can stipulate part of this offer is tenant needs to sign the new lease. You can have due diligence clauses, which is normally 14 to 28 days. Finance clauses, build and pest. You can put options on the property. So there's some good there. In a hot market, the best is try to have your options limited for those kind of extra
Mm. That's
conditions.
right.
So try to have it as short as you can. So get your finance in a row, and then you can, if you're in a lucky position to go unconditional from the get go, and you can do all that due diligence. It takes about 20-30 hours, so it's not like you flick a light switch and kind of do it. Going unconditional is really strong in this market. You can kind of get stuff 5-10% below market value.
Awesome. On this podcast, I talk about the concept of financial health. Often there's lots of professionals, including healthcare professionals, that are very time poor, not taking care of their finances. What are some good financial habits that you yourself have implemented?
My, I'll probably say my lesson. I'll say my biggest lesson has actually been not to trust anyone with my own money, and even like I don't want your clients and listeners to trust me. Like always do your due diligence, cross check everything that anyone sends you because everyone's got an agenda. Like I used to think people at heart were really well natured, but as I've slowly learned in this industry, when money's involved, 99.9% of people aren't. They're just looking to get paid. So make sure you understand what you're investing. Don't go to a financial advisor and just trust them that they're going to look out for you. Or a buyer's agent like me. Don't just come and say, oh, Steve, find me a great property and accept it. I prove it's good property through like an 80-page due diligence report where I show you all the details and cross-check it. And I give you a Dropbox with about 50 files that show cross-checking it. But that was probably my biggest life lesson is just get yourself educated. And I know there's a lot of doctor forums and things like that, which they're trying to help with that, which is a start. But the problem I found with those is because as I mentioned to you before, prior to the podcast, I used to be married to a doctor. The people who know the least are normally shouting the highest with like advice. So don't necessarily listen to anyone in those forums. They're not experts. They haven't purchased 1,500 plus properties. They're just saying what someone else told them.
Yeah, very good words. So I guess we're all in this kind of to get passive income and financial freedom. For you, what does financial freedom mean?
It's going to be a typical answer of just like doing what you want when you want. But for me, it's not about that. It's probably more just about like not having to do things you don't want to. You get to work on your own time schedule. And that's even what I found like when I was an engineer and I thought I had a really good passive income. I was like, yeah, I've got a 50 grand passive income. Work became enjoyable again because you got confidence that you didn't have to cop anything from your boss. Like it'd be 4 p.m. on a Friday and they'd be like, oh, can you finish this before you go home? And you'd be like, no, I'm sorry, I'm going to the pub with my mate. I've got it pre-booked. And you just go. And then weirdly, I actually started getting promoted from my arrogance because they're like, oh, Steve's a great delegator. So I think having it behind you, it's not for everyone knows all the standard answers of like, oh, live life on your terms, go travel the world.
Yeah.
I can tell you after the last 2 years of traveling, you can't travel forever. You need some passion. But I find life's more enjoyable when you know you don't have to do things you don't want to.
Awesome. Tell me what makes you excited at the moment. Is there any kind of passion project you're working on? I understand you've just come back from traveling.
Yeah, I've got a 4-month-old daughter, so she's probably my passion project of getting a full night's sleep is probably the next task. I want to do something in the property world, like charity-wise, moving forward. So that's probably the next phase, just something kind of in a third world country or something like that. Even weirdly, get back into engineering and not in the regards to go work for a company, just go work with a little tech startup or something like that and just keep the passion projects going. Like I said, I only want to work 4 or 5 hours a day in the end. And then the rest of the time is family, friends, passion projects, and not doing things because of money.
Any closing thoughts or advice for our doctor listeners trying to reach financial freedom?
Probably just talk to as many people as you can and don't try to get rich quick. Like anyone who's offering you a really quick way to get there. And like I know I've spoken about on this podcast about passive incomes quickly from commercial. It's not quickly. We're talking 5 to 15 years. Like it's still a slow period. But like I mentioned, don't trust anyone. Get yourself educated. Talk to lots of professionals and just try to make some informed decisions.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Steve, for coming onto the show today and sharing your wisdom. How can people connect with you?
Yeah, so I'm all over social media. I'm a bit of a whore there with like videos and education materials. So just type in Steve Palise on Google. My website's paliseproperty.com, but I'm on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. So just I'm sure when we post this, we can put it in the show notes or something. And yeah, just reach out. But like I said, if you want a copy of the book, paliseproperty.com and type in free book at checkout.
Awesome. And that'd be a great benefit to our listeners. Thank you again.
Awesome. Thanks, mate. It's a pleasure.